Fuck you to the French. Atrocious Autochthony in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Amidst the Middle Ages came the alliterative revival, a sudden explosion around 1315 to 1415 that featured resurgence in alliterative verse. Commonly associated with the English Midlands, it followed a French aristocratic dominance. This traditionally English identity uniquely manifests itself in the manuscript Cataniro AX, in that it is the sole verse form. The poet of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, hence, among other reasons, seems interested in British history. Hailing from the northwestern Midlands of England, the traditionally transfixed poet paints the Green Knight's figure to be natively autochthonous in nature, in order to resuscitate his ideology of Brythonic culture in King Arthur's corrupt and cosmopolitan, yet colonizing court. As Rhonda Knight so devastatingly details in her article, there was very much a colonial relationship between Wales and England. She goes on to suggest representatives of this Anglo-Welsh border in the poem, such as Berdylac's role as a border lord, quote, who holds the border with Wales, end quote, and his Green Knight persona's physical description suggesting the, quote, otherworldliness of Wales. Identifying the parallel between the poetic Arthurian court in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the historical court of King Edward II, she shows their mobile metropolitan culture. How King Edward II's court spent considerable time in the North and Northwest Midlands, and how it was imagined as England's, quote, ideological centre, and the locus from whence came diplomacy, fashion, and literature, end quote. But I would go so far as to call this kind of court cosmopolitan, despite its colonizing disposition, because of foreign elements, to which I will soon return. Immediately, the concern the poet has for what truly constitutes Britishness becomes apparent. From the very first line, the reader witnesses how he instantiates King Arthur to descend from Trojan truth. He describes how, quote, "For over the French flood Felix Brutus, on money full broad Breton he set his widowine," end quote. He notably skips over France, which Professor Coley supposes to be a, quote, "fuck you to the French." While the poet illustrates Britain to have Trojan heritage through translatio studiae et imperi, and thus illustrates the same of the British King Arthur, he also exemplifies the link between native Brythonic folklore and diasporic cultural conquest. It is here that emerges the first glimpse of his intention to recodify the Celtic court with his indigenous culture. He gives the reader his corrupted conception of the Arthurian court, planting a seed of a childishness. The poet describes the, quote, flower of youth in the hall, and Arthur as boyish. If Arthur is not told a curious tale about some perilous thing, of some great wonder that he could believe, of princes, of battles, or other marvels, like a child at the dinner table he will never eat, end quote. Moreover, the poet depicts the excessive decadence of the court, with, quote, double helpings of food served on the days, end quote, and, quote, excited argument over New Year's gifts. The poet interweaves into the extravagant image the fine materials adorning Queen Guinevere, including, quote, silk, gems, and importantly, a canopy overhead of costly French fabric, end quote. All while infantilizing the Round Table and depicting its excessive expenditure, the poet enmeshes its frivolity with its, as hinted to earlier in this paper, foreign French influence, something the English court has been permeated with since the Anglo-Norman conquest of 1066. It is in this critical attitude that we witness how the poet bears this cosmopolitan culture that manifests in his Celtic icon. Thence, as the Green Knight appears, so too does the contradictory motifs and ideologies he symbolizes. And as Rhonda Knight points out, the Green Knight's description embodies both otherworldly characteristics of the provincial Anglo-Wales border and the fashionable attire of the dominant, centralized metropolitan court. He exudes a wildness that she believes to be his, quote, primary aspect, juxtaposed to what she deems to be his courtly, quote, drag. Such performative drag, she argues, mocks the court's culture rather than emulating it, challenging racial and class lines. She quotes Carroll and Taylor to condense this idea. Quote, "One does ideology in order to undo it, producing knowledge about it," end quote. In this way, the Green Knight serves as the incarnation of the poet's critical view, a view of a corrupted court in need of a reminder as to what it should Britishly be. The autochthonous nature of the Green Knight is clear as soon as he appears in the fourth and final fit. The ancient Greek idea of being born from the earth shows when the Green Knight shows himself, quote, "bursting out of a hole in the ground," end quote. Just like how those mythological people do from a serpent's teeth, supposedly populating Thebes. Thus sprouts a birth motif. This autochthonous and thereby indigenous, which incidentally is the word autochtone in French, nature leads itself to his appearance. Romanticizing the knight, the poet paints the natural green of the character to be as, quote, "astounding to the court," end quote, as the rest of his, quote, "equally elegant body." In fact, amidst the sparkling rain on, quote, "smiling plains where flowers unfold, the open fields and woodlands put on green dress," end quote. Here, the same green that dresses the Green Knight is the green dress of this pastoral nature. And before any other interaction occurs, King Arthur invites in this beautiful and pastoral otherworldliness with open arms. Quote, "Wych, welcome iwis to this place. The head of this hostel Arthur I at, licht luf adun en lenga I de prey," end quote. This kind of acceptance the cosmopolitan court bears unto outsiders is exactly what the poet seeks to rectify. In response, the autochthonous Green Knight, calling those of the court, quote, "beardless children," issues his challenge. And when no one accepts, he mocks the Frenchified court for not holding up to the famous standard of the indigenous Arthurian folklore they represent. He asks, "What? Is this Arthur's house that everyone talks of in so many kingdoms? Where are now your arrogance and your victories, your fierceness and your wrath and your great speeches? Now the revelry and the repute of the Round Table are overthrown with a word from one man's mouth, for all of you cower in fear before even a blow has been struck." Then he laughed so uproariously that the king took offense. End quote. This contempt for the Arthurian court, for its supposed corruption by foreign French customs, is clear. Thus, his contemptuous challenge dares Sir Gawain, quote, "the chosen representative of the Arthurian court by Jost," end quote, to seek him out in his green chapel so that he may deal him a blow in return. Strikingly, this results in a border crossing. According to Rhonda Knight, as the community garnishes Gawain with a chivalric armor, they also communally transform him into their cultural icon, as a, quote, "cultural collage," like the Green Knight is for the Brythonic Anglo-Welsh region. Sir Gawain serves to project his community's dominant colonial court, voyaging off into indigenous Celtic region. But in order to remember the Brythonic culture his court ought to embody, the poem has Sir Gawain retrieve what is supposedly true to its original Celtic myth, the Green Girdle. Ironically, this very same Frenchified courtly culture for which Sir Gawain stands becomes his undoing. The lady finally succeeds in getting Gawain to accept her green girdle. After she fractures his identity by questioning it, he succumbs to his fear and forgoes his chivalric code. The green girdle, as Rhonda Knight discerns, is a Welsh cultural artifact that is interwoven into Gawain's ideological icon. Such supports the poet's wish to recodify Arthurian civilization. The setting where this happens is a courtly one too, filled with as much aristocracy and aristocratic courtesy as Gawain's is back home. And as the translator James Winnie vitally notes, the French language is still very much alien to the poet and his Northwestern audience. Thus, when it comes about in the courtly manners between Gawain and the hostess, quote, of all chivalry to shows, the chef tingalozid is the lelek of loof, the letrur of armis, end quote. The poet contrasts it with his natural and bare narrative style through his native Middle English dialect. Here again resurfaces the fiendishly foreign of the English court. The poet isolates through deliberate diction, thereby subduing Gawain. In between the seduction and the wild external hunting scenes of Bertilac and his men, the poet demonizes yet another French foreign element. The final scene, which features the literally sly fox named Renard, who repeatedly outwits the hunters, parallels indeed to the lady's success in tricking Sir Gawain. To explain, Reynard the Fox was an incredibly popular figure in European folklore during the Middle Ages, detailing a, quote, facetious rustic life and the triumph of craft over brute strength, end quote. His main literary tradition was from France, roman de renard, and he was so popular there, in fact, that the official French word for a fox, goupille, came to be replaced by the character's name renard, which lingers even today. So, this lady is demonized not only by Gawain's misogynist outburst later, but also by this parallel Renard. The way he, quote, creeps stealthily, thinking to escape from the wood and hounds by his wiles, reveals a fiendishly foreign streak with which the poet compares the lady. In this text also lies aesthetic ideologies of skin tone, betraying more racial and cultural bias. The first glimpse of the skin aesthetic is what the courtiers see of the Green Knight's neck while Sir Gawain decapitates it. The only part of him vividly imagined as something other than green just so happens to be, quote, white flesh, which makes way for his handsome head to be sent flying. The poet further beautifies white skin when he juxtaposes two ladies at Bertilac's court. Specifically, he mentions how Bertilac's wife, the, quote, beautiful one, is the loveliest on earth in complexion and features, in figure, in coloring and behavior above all others, and more beautiful than Guinevere, it seems to the knight, end quote. Meanwhile, the other one, quote, is withered and rough. Wrinkled cheeks hang on her in folds. Significantly, he emphasizes the coloring of these women as he portrays their beauty. He depicts the young one's, quote, breast and white throat, uncovered and bare, shining more dazzlingly than snow new fallen on hills, end quote. The poet thus evokes an ideological beauty rooted in her whiteness. In contrast, the poet disfigures the other's phenotypes, her, quote, swarthy complexion and black brows, calling them, quote, repulsive to see, end quote. Notably, such dark phenotypes are found more frequently in France, with its region being farther south than Britain and more Mediterranean. Therefore, the poet conflates dark features with ugliness to racialize beauty, something that further suggests his xenophobic attitude, an attitude he bears unto the cosmopolitan court. In the end, the culturally Brythonic Green Knight turns out to be well received. He grants Gawain the Celtic green girdle as a token of friendship, which he in turn gratefully accepts. Ronda Knight argues this fails. The Arthurian court laughs at Gawain's story, and although they accept it, they culturally appropriate it. The symbolic Welsh artifact is dissociated from its cultural truth and redefined according to the court's identity. They assimilate it as an, quote, icon of fellowship, end quote, continuing the colonial metropolitan culture critiqued so heavily by the poet, just as they have done from the start when they saw nothing but entertainment in the Green Knight's entrance. The final line of the poem's manuscript in Anglo-Norman French is the motto of the Order of the Garter founded by King Edward III. Honi soit qui mal pense. Shamed be whoever thinks ill of it, which possibly suggests who had this poem commissioned. It also reflects this carefree sentiment of the contemporary aristocracy. This is what I see as a failure of Bertilac to re-center the Arthurian court in what he believes to be true British culture, but also a failure of the court to change from their cosmopolitan yet colonizing ways. Which path of progression would have been the most moral? The fruit of accepting the cross-cultural connections of medieval texts like this one, however, is the exciting opportunities of exploration for which it creates a path already beginning to be paved by those connections found between the Green Knight and the Arabian folkloric figure of Al-Qadir, and by articles like Ananda K. Kumaraswamy's that draws parallels with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in Indian folklore. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Indra and Namuchi.